Talk or die.
The young officer's voice hissed through the rust-thick air. Sweat beaded on his forehead, reflecting the single jaundiced bulb hanging from the rafters. His breath reeked of cheap power, as the cold metal baton pressed hard against the gaunt chest of the old black man bound to the chair. But before the second blow could land, the warehouse door was ripped open. A shadow burst in, faster than an eye could follow. An arm lock. A takedown. The baton clattered across the concrete, silencing the torture. This was no mere bystander. He was the ghost the government had declared dead years ago, the old man's son, a legendary Delta Force operator. This kidnapping wasn't a random act. It was a symptom of a cancer that had metastasized throughout this town. An illegal surveillance program, a weapons trafficking ring, and a legacy of violence passed down from one generation of cops to the next. When the lawmen are the criminals, is justice served with a badge or a bullet? Comment where you're watching this from. And don't look away. The truth this town has buried for half a century is about to be dragged into the light. Red Willow pressed itself between the dry lands of the South, a place people like to call a sleeping town. But anyone who lived there long enough knew a different truth. It didn't sleep. It just held back, like an old pressure cooker lid always quivering. The main road stretched past a few old shops with peeling signs. A handful of older white folks sat early at the diner, clutching cheap coffee cups with a look that said, "This is my land. You're just passing through." Everyone in Red Willow knew the town hall was the heart of the place, not because of any real power, but because of the wall in the main lobby, where large portraits of police heroes from decades past were displayed. All of them were white men with the same raised chin, the same cold stare, the kind that silently said the law here only followed their will. Every time Harold Green passed that wall, he felt like someone was standing behind him, gently squeezing his shoulder and whispering the same old line, "You're alive, because I let you be." Harold Green was 71, dried up like a branch after a long winter. His shoulders slumped from years of bending over old radios. His gray hair was uneven, a sign of someone who no longer cared about appearances. He lived in a small house on the edge of South Ridge, which Red Willow folks casually called the black side of town. People there worked hard jobs for low pay and came home too exhausted to wonder what excuse the police would use next. Harold wasn't the kind to raise his voice or argue. He quietly repaired radios, rewired, adjusted frequencies, earning his living with hands that trembled but still hit every mark. In this town, his name was known by everyone, but in a way that made him feel like he was always at the back of the line. They knew his name to mispronounce it, to yell it, to haggle him down, never to show respect. Black folks who came to his shop called him Mr. Green. But when the police dropped off equipment, they just said, "Old man, fix this quick," then stood around, looking like they were checking if anything in his house seemed suspicious. Harold had grown so used to being looked down on that sometimes he didn't even realize how far he had bent until the pain hit when he stood back up. Of all the things Harold had collected in his life, the radio set to frequency 67.9 was the one he guarded most. It was so old that the wires had to be wrapped in 3 layers of tape, and its plastic casing was scratched all over. But when he turned it on, the crackling sound came out like the breath of an old friend. Harold called it the dead man's channel, a phrase that sounded chilling to others, but to him was a way of remembering those who once lived, once spoke on that same frequency, and then vanished after run-ins with Red Willow's police. He remembered each of them. The cheerful mechanic who disappeared after a traffic stop, the widow dragged from her home for suspicion of possession, the boy from down the street knocked unconscious in front of the corner store and never mentioned again. The static from that radio reminded Harold that they had existed, that their voices had once traveled across the waves just like his did now. Sometimes, he sat on his steps with the radio on his lap, staring out at the dusty road and listening to the noise the way others might listen to lullabies, because at least there, no one told him to shut up. Red Willow didn't need signs or books to teach racism. It was in the air, in the looks people gave, in the half-step of distance they kept from black folks. Anyone who grew up there learned quickly. Police talked to black people in a tone like they were talking to animals. Words like move, hands out, ID, now rang out daily with no please or thank you ever attached. An elderly black woman carrying bags across the street got yelled at, "Move it! You're blocking traffic," even though two white men nearby were just as slow. A black child who stood in a store for more than a minute had the owner step out, hand on hip, eyes squinted with suspicion. A black student who came to school late was pulled into the principal's office and had his pockets checked, like his skin color alone was reason enough for doubt. It all added up to a bitter truth that everyone in South Ridge understood in Red Willow: the wrong question could cost you blood. Harold had heard enough stories to know how to stay out of trouble. He avoided conflict, even when they twisted facts right in front of him. Once, the police stood in the middle of the market and told a young black man, "There's no place in Red Willow for your kind to hold your head up." People nearby just looked down, pretending to pick apples or tomatoes not out of agreement, but because everyone knew speaking up would only land them in jail for the night, with no paperwork. Harold always reminded himself to keep quiet. But every time he looked at the town hall wall, he remembered the day a young black man was shot dead in front of him 40 years ago. Remembered the circle of cops around the body, casually saying, "self-defense," before walking off like it was nothing. He'd been silent ever since, silent out of fear, out of poverty, out of the knowledge that no one would listen to someone like him. But deep down, he knew time didn't shrink that fear. It just waited, still and patient, for the right moment to rise. And Red Willow always knew how to remind a black man that in this town, the past never really dies. That night, Red Willow was so quiet, you could hear dry leaves scraping along the pavement, the kind of quiet that makes people uneasy, not comforted. Harold Green sat at his old wooden table, hand turning the worn frequency dial, eyes fixed on the face of the radio, like it was someone he knew. He tuned in to channel 67.9, just like every other night. The familiar static helped fill the emptiness of the small kitchen. But tonight, the sound changed, sharper, static, louder, stretching into a screech like a knife dragging across a tin lid. Harold froze. That old radio rarely acted up, unless it picked up something it wasn't supposed to. He leaned in closer, held his breath, waiting to hear what the signal wanted to say. Seconds later, what he heard chilled his blood like ice water down his spine. Buried in the static was a young man's voice, clear, rushed, with a deep southern drawl, but the tone of command. "New surveillance target marked. South Ridge priority." Blacklist updated. Harold pushed his chair back, heart pounding, even though he was too old to run if something happened. South Ridge was his neighborhood. The black neighborhood. An updated blacklist meant someone else had just been added. He had lived in Red Willow long enough to know exactly what kind of system that voice came from, what kind of people had the power to say those words, and what happened to the names that landed on that list. Harold took a long breath, eyes still locked on the radio. If he stared hard enough, he'd see the face behind the voice. This wasn't a civilian frequency. No way. This was internal, one of those secure lines only used by people in the system or the ones given the green light to access it. And when an internal channel started mentioning a residential area, it only meant a few things, none of them good. He knew Red Willow police still watched South Ridge. That had never been a secret. They had watched it for years, since long before Harold was young enough to run from them. But hearing a young voice give direct orders like, "Mark new target," brought back the same cold. He felt the day a young black man collapsed right in front of him, while a whole group of cops stood around like they were guarding an Alper. "Animal." The radio crackled again. "Focus on the southern sector. Urgent." Then came the faint sound of metal clinking. hurried footsteps, and silence. Harold sat frozen for a long while, hand still resting on the dial, too stiff to turn it anymore. He knew he had heard something dangerous, heard too deep into the gut of Red Willow, where the law only worked if your skin was the right color. The signal choked off at the end, cut fast like someone had shut it down before it got traced. That was all Harold needed to know. Something big was brewing, and no one in South Ridge wanted to be part of it. He also knew that if the radio picked it up, someone had slipped up and he had just become a witness by accident. Harold stood up, took the radio, and walked out to the front porch. The night had laid its usual blanket of silence over South Ridge. A few streetlights flickered like they were about to give out. He sat on the steps, set the radio on his lap, and looked out at the dark homes. A few of the older neighbors usually stayed up late, but tonight no lights shone from their windows. Only the soft wind and a far-off dog barking. He felt like he was holding a ticking bomb, and nobody else in town even knew it was counting down. That radio wasn't just talk. It was a real plan. At that moment, he saw the shadow of Eddie, the old friend who lived 3 houses down, locking his gate and getting ready for bed. Harold called out softly, not loud, because he knew in Red Willow, calling out at night could easily draw the police's attention. "Eddie, I just heard something." Eddie walked over, his back hunched from years of hard labor. Harold handed him the radio to replay the bit of leftover static. Eddie listened, squinted, his face tightening, then sighed. "They're sniffing around again." Harold gave a slight nod, his voice bitter. "In this town, a black man breathing is a crime." Eddie let out a dry laugh, but his eyes were sad, the kind of sadness so deep it no longer knew how to cry. "You're not wrong, Harold. They always need a new excuse to start something." The 2 old men sat for a while, silent enough to hear the soft bubbling from the radio. In Harold's mind, an old memory from 1971 resurfaced the face of the young man lying on the ground, cops standing around like they were watching something normal. He used to think old age would help him forget that memory, but clearly Red Willow didn't allow someone like him the right to forget. Tonight's signal only made him feel like the silence he'd kept for half a lifetime was starting to wake up, like someone had poked an old wound just to see if it still hurt. Harold looked at the radio, then out at the empty street, his eyes still reacting to the shock. He wanted to tell himself it was just interference, but he was an old man now, had lived long enough to tell the difference between a real voice and one trying to hide. The young voice on the radio was the kind that worked by habit, the kind used to thinking a black life was just another number on a list. And Harold knew, if a new list was forming, South Ridge would be the first to pay. Before heading back inside, Harold turned the dial again, hoping to catch another clue. But all that remained was the cold hiss coming through the small speaker. He carried the radio into the kitchen, set it on the table, and stared at it for a few seconds like looking at a friend who had just delivered bad news and had nothing more to say. He felt this wasn't going to end with just a strange signal, and deep inside him, something had started to move, something that had lain still for more than 40 years. Bradford Holloway showed up in Red Willow's newspapers with a name that sounded like sunshine on a hot day. The White Knight of the Community. It was the kind of title local papers loved to throw around like he was the only thing keeping the town from falling apart. To anyone watching from the outside, he looked generous, dressed like a picture-perfect businessman, with slicked-back hair, a blue tie, and a smile always right where it needed to be. He funded the high school, bought new fire trucks, gave out scholarships to the 2 top white students in class, basically did everything to make people think he was a good man. The white folks downtown saw him as a blessing. Mention Holloway's name and they'd nod like, yeah. Without him, Red Willow would be screwed. Black folks would glance at each other and say nothing, because they knew how this town worked. The ones held highest were usually standing on somebody else's back. That afternoon, Harold Green left the grocery store with a small bag of rice. He stood near a few men from South Ridge, all of them watching the TV hanging by the cashier's counter. On screen was a live broadcast of the new patrol car handover right in front of City Hall. Bradford Holloway stood in the center of the courtyard, his hand draped over Police Chief Mills's shoulder, the kind of friendly gesture that only looks casual when you know where the real power lies. Both men laughed in front of a line of cameras, while applause broke out from the crowd of white townspeople gathered to watch. The new patrol cars rolled slowly across the frame, shiny and spotless, flashing red and blue, like it was Christmas morning. Holloway turned to Mills and said something, then laughed again, the kind of laugh that underlined one thing: he and the police force were one and the same. They were stronger because of him. The people at the register stared at the screen. A white man said, "Mr. Holloway's a good man. Really cares about this place." Harold bit his lip and stayed quiet, but Eddie, standing next to him, let out a quiet snort. Only Harold could hear. They didn't speak up because experience had taught them that speaking up about Holloway didn't lead anywhere good. Behind him was the whole Red Willow machine. That night, back home, Harold turned on the radio, but his mind was still stuck on the image of Holloway with his arm around Mills. He had seen plenty of Holloway's charity events, one fundraiser after another, but whenever you looked just a little deeper, it all came back to money and control. Bradford Holloway had a pattern anyone paying attention could spot. He never did anything without some kind of gain. Sometimes it was immediate. Sometimes it took time. Harold remembered a black woman in South Ridge asking for help fixing her house after a storm. Holloway gave her barely anything, then said, "People have to help themselves." A few months later, he donated nearly $10,000 to a gun show run by a group of white hunters. Harold listened to the steady crackle of static. He couldn't shake the feeling that the strange signal the night before and Holloway's cheerful TV appearance were somehow connected. To the black community, a word like donation coming from someone like Holloway didn't sound like generosity. It felt like a rope slowly tightening around the whole neighborhood. Watching the broadcast, the way Holloway looked at the camera there was something hidden in his eyes, like a man standing in front of a crowd, but already planning who to push off the edge next. Harold didn't know the exact details of Red Willow's budget, but he knew someone on the city council. A friend of a friend had once whispered about line items that never got read out loud during meetings. Internal expenditures, the kind of paperwork that could cost you your job if you got one word wrong. Once, Harold overheard something strange in that year's funding list: surveillance equipment for high-risk areas. And in Red Willow, what did high-risk area usually mean? South Ridge. Hearing that made his chest burn, because no one called a neighborhood full of aging workers high risk unless they were looking for a reason to keep it under watch. Eddie once said something to Harold that everyone in South Ridge would nod at the moment they heard it. Whoever funds the police the most is also the one who kills us the fastest. It wasn't a curse or some dark joke, it was lived truth. Whoever paid the police in Red Willow got their orders followed first. Who to watch, who to pressure, who to clean out. Black folks knew this so well that it became instinct, the kind of instinct that made them steer clear of car donation ceremonies, even steer clear when the cameras rolled as police shook hands with businessmen, because they knew hidden in those handshakes was a slap across their community's face. That night, Harold stared at the radio, thoughts heavy and tangled. He understood Holloway wasn't the type to stop once he set his mind on expanding into something. Red Willow was small as a fist, any change spread fast like noise. The radio catching a blacklist signal and the image of Holloway praising the police were just tiny pieces in a larger puzzle, and the old man had lived long enough to know that the more complete the puzzle became, the more dangerous it got for the weaker side. Harold turned off the kitchen light and stepped into his room, but the image of Holloway still followed his footsteps. He felt the future veering toward something unpredictable, and what he'd heard on the radio the night before was only the opening sound of something about to sweep through South Ridge. It all started with a businessman praised as the white knight of the community. But those at the bottom of the ladder knew Red Willow had never had a white knight, only war horses trained to trample anyone standing in the wrong place. Harold lay down with his eyes still open, listening to the wind outside the porch, and knowing one thing as sure as the ground under his feet tonight: Red Willow was too quiet, in a way that warned of a coming shake no one would easily escape. Brandon Hale grew up in a family where the story of the day Grandpa handled that black kid back in '71 was told like a victory tale. At dinner, his father would bring it up in a half-boasting, half-preaching tone, the kind that hammered in the idea that Hale men never backed down, that when it was time to act, you acted so long as it was the right person. And in Red Willow, the right person always meant someone black. Brandon had heard that since he was little, so he developed a habit of looking at black people with a measuring eye, like he was deciding if they were obedient enough or needed to be corrected. By the time he was 35, he stepped into a patrol car with the attitude of someone handed the keys to other people's fate, and he enjoyed that power far more than necessary. Most folks in South Ridge had at least one bad memory of Brandon. When he pulled them over on the South Hill, he always gave a little smirk before speaking a smug smile that said, "I know you're scared of me." Then came his usual opening line, repeated like a bad habit: "Papers." Now, no questions. He never asked if people were okay, never asked where they were going, just held out his hand and waited, like their existence was an inconvenience to him. One time, an old man selling melons got pulled over under the noon sundae. His hands were shaking so badly that he pulled out the wrong wallet. Brandon sneered, "Old man, hands like that and you still think you can drive?" Then slammed his hand on the hood, making the man flinch. For Brandon, forcing black people to bow down was just another part of the job, a kind of personal authority he saw as a family privilege. At the police station, Brandon didn't bother hiding his attitude. He walked past younger officers with a cocky swagger, sometimes slapping one on the back and dropping a cold line like, "In Red Willow, the Hale name talks the loudest." People laughed it off, but everyone knew he meant it. Chief Mills respected the Hale family, and Holloway was always backing them from the shadows. When the internal report came through about the frequency breach, the dispatcher's voice was tense. Someone picked up a priority channel in South Ridge. Brandon instantly looked at his partner, eyes lighting up like he'd been handed a gift-wrapped excuse. He asked sharply, "Who the hell opened that line?" When he heard the name Harold Green, his face relaxed into something halfway between amusement and contempt. "The old radio guy," he said. "Classic one of those nosy old fools poking at stuff that ain't theirs." What Brandon hated most were old black men who still carried a bit of pride. In the break room, he'd always rant about how those types forgot their place, how South Ridge should be grateful we leave it alone. So when he heard Harold had tapped into an internal channel, he took it as a challenge. Leaning against his locker, spinning his patrol car keys, he said out loud, "Old black men only live because we allow it. They've forgotten that for too long." A young cop making coffee looked up, almost said something, then lowered his eyes and stayed quiet. In Red Willow, crossing the Hale family was the fastest way to lose your job or worse. That afternoon, the skies over Red Willow were overcast. Brandon sat in his patrol car. The internal radio gave a few crackles, then went silent. He wasn't worried about Harold. He was annoyed. Annoyed in the way of someone used to having everything go his way, suddenly seeing someone touch what wasn't theirs. He remembered a story his father once told, how back in '71, federal investigators came to town but didn't do a damn thing to his grandfather because all of Red Willow stood together. The system was so tight that no outsider could break it. Brandon believed that, like he believed the sun would rise. And because he'd believed it so long, he thought every mistake he made could be erased, so long as he covered it the right way. To him, Harold Green was just another old black man with a cheap radio, not worth the worry. But the order to investigate the frequency leak made him restless. He knew that if someone in South Ridge had heard internal comms, it meant the surveillance plan was being watched. Brandon muttered under his breath like scolding someone who wasn't there. "Old man, you got your hands on something that wasn't meant for you." He turned the wheel and headed toward South Ridge, thinking he had to take care of Harold quick and clean. To him, this didn't need a report, didn't need permission, just needed to slip through a gray area in the system and find a reason that sounded good enough. Driving downhill, Brandon watched South Ridge residents walking along the sidewalk, eyes passing over them like scanning objects. He flicked on the internal radio, listened to the dispatcher repeat the morning report. He didn't care about the details. What made his skin prickle was the fact that Harold had landed in the potential risk group. And to Brandon, risk meant eliminate if you can. So in his mind, there was only one next step. When the patrol car turned onto the gravel road that led to Harold's house, Brandon clicked on the lights softly, tapped the steering wheel to a rhythm, and that familiar smirk crept across his face. He pictured the old man with his radio, alone and startled when the knock came. For Brandon, tonight was a chance to replay a lesson the Hale family had always passed down. In Red Willow, anyone who dared to eavesdrop on the voice of white men was choosing their own death. He believed that so deeply, he didn't bother thinking 2 steps ahead. Because in Brandon Hale's mind, everything always snapped back to the way it was meant to be. The night air in Red Willow had a sharp chill to it, the kind that made old bones creak softly with every step. Harold Green clutched his tool bag, walking slowly along the dirt road toward home, his back slightly bent from exhaustion. He had spent the whole day repairing 4 old radios for customers in South Ridge. By evening, his eyes were tired, and his hands trembled slightly, but he kept his pace steady. The streetlights flickered as if about to die, their yellow glow just enough to catch the mist drifting in front of his face. Harold wanted to get inside and warm up, but just as he reached the gate, the sound of an engine behind him made him freeze. A Red Willow patrol car rolled up without sirens, its tires moving slowly, as if stalking. Harold gripped his tool bag tighter and turned his head, his heart tightening in the familiar reflex of someone who had lived too long at the bottom of this society. Brandon Hale stepped out, posture bold, authority dripping from the way he shut the car door. He walked straight toward Harold, his shadow stretching under the streetlight. "What the hell are you doing with that radio?" Brandon asked, his voice carrying both threat and contempt. "Who the hell do you think you are, messing with something that ain't meant for you?" Harold swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice, though his heart pounded. He opened his mouth to explain he'd only heard some static, hadn't broken any laws, but the words barely reached his throat before a punch landed square on his cheek. Brandon struck fast, like someone who'd wanted to do it for a long time. The blow was so hard that Harold staggered, his tool bag hitting the ground with a heavy thud. The night's cold made the pain sharper. Harold reeled, his vision dimming for a moment, grabbing the nearby fence to keep from collapsing onto the road. Brandon stepped closer, the smell of cigarette smoke and heavy coat filling Harold's nose. "You think we don't know?" he said, low and cutting. "You think we're just going to let you listen in and walk away?" Harold wanted to say he hadn't heard anything but some static and a few broken words, but Brandon didn't let him speak. He grabbed Harold by the collar and yanked him close, his voice dropping even lower, more venomous. "Old man, I'll say it once, don't stick your nose in white folks' business." His eyes glinted with the same cruelty Harold had seen in many Red Willow officers before. But in Brandon it was clearer, like he truly believed he was doing the right thing. Harold felt his legs wobble, but he fought to stay standing, if only to hold on to the last shred of dignity. That only made Brandon angrier. He shoved Harold halfway into the fence. "I told you, South Ridge needs to learn its place," he said, then went back to the car and pulled out an old burlap sack. Harold saw it under the streetlight and knew this was going beyond the usual lessons the police liked to hand out in this neighborhood. He didn't have time to react. Brandon yanked the sack over his head, pulling it down tight. Everything went dark. His breath turned frantic. Harold tried to lift his head, but Brandon's rough hand shoved it down hard, forcing a pained grunt from his lips. "All done," Brandon muttered, like checking something off a list. He dragged Harold a few steps, gravel shifting beneath their feet, the dry, scraping sound sending chills down Harold's spine. He couldn't see anything, only felt the pain in his arm being yanked, the force on his shoulder, as Brandon pulled him toward the patrol car. Harold tried to say, "I didn't," but Brandon yanked his arm so hard the words choked off inside the sack. Brandon opened the back door, shoved him in like throwing out trash, and slammed it shut. Outside, Harold heard Brandon pick something up. It was his radio, the old 67.9 model that had dropped when he was punched. Brandon looked at it for a second, then threw it to the ground. The dry crack of plastic breaking sounded like something inside Harold snapping too. The radio lay there on the pavement, next to the spilled tool bag, screws, and parts glittering under the yellow streetlight. Brandon opened the driver's door, got in, and the patrol car pulled away. Inside the dark sack, Harold felt every jolt of the gravel road. He could hear the engine hum like a warning, reminding him he was being taken somewhere no one would know. He tried to keep his breathing steady, but in his mind was the familiar fear of someone who had seen people taken and never seen them come back. Cold crept into his spine, and the engine's growl seemed to sync with the pounding of his heart. The car rolled past South Ridge, leaving behind the old radio lying alone in the street witness to yet another night in Red Willow, where someone was dragged into the dark and no one screamed to stop it. The patrol car drove deep into the western lot until Harold could no longer hear any other engines, only the steady hum of the car and the sound of his own breathing inside the pitch-black burlap sack. When the car stopped, he was dragged out, legs buckling from weak knees after a hard shove. Brandon Hale pulled the sack off, just as the harsh yellow light from the warehouse roof hit his face, making Harold's eyes sting. The abandoned warehouse looked like a place meant for keeping livestock. Rusted tin roof, cracked cement floor, long shadows that stretched like they led to a morgue, and a damp smell mixed with something sharp that made Harold's throat tighten. Brandon's shadow fell across the floor, and in the middle of that yellow glow, he stood like a man deciding whether Harold lived another minute. Harold was dragged to a folding chair placed at the center of the warehouse. Brandon kicked the leg of the chair so it snapped open, then shoved Harold down onto it. The ropes bit into his wrists until the skin burned. His maroon coat had torn at the shoulder, and blood was trickling down his sleeve. The mix of blood and dry dust made his head spin. He tried to lift his face, but the swinging yellow bulb above burned into his eyes. Every breath in tasted of old metal. Every breath out carried the cold of a building that hadn't known real life in years. This wasn't a place for questions. This was a place to turn people into vague memories. Brandon stood across from him, hands on his thighs, leaning forward to stare directly into his eyes. Then he spat on the floor at Harold's feet, a soft sound that landed like a slap to the soul. His voice came slowly, each word sharp and deliberate. "Old man, I'm only going to ask once. Who told you to stick your nose in white folks' business?" The words dropped like a stone. No shouting, no threats, just the way he said, "white folks," made it clear Red Willow had always been a place where one side held power and the other endured it. Harold swallowed hard. His jaw still ached from an earlier punch, but what chilled him wasn't the hit. It was Brandon's voice. In that yellow light, his eyes looked like two wet stones empty of doubt, full of judgment. Harold opened his mouth to explain that he hadn't been eavesdropping, that he had just turned on the radio like he always did and happened to catch something Brandon had said. He barely got halfway through. When Brandon slapped him across the face. The blow was so hard that the folding chair rattled. Brandon growled, "I don't need your explanation," then tilted his head, eyes full of disgust. "I need you to remember your place." Harold clenched his teeth to keep from crying out. A moment flashed in his mind years ago, when a young man had been shot at the old market corner, and he had stood frozen while cops surrounded the body. It was the same look in their eyes he saw now. The look that said a black life meant less than a number. Brandon grabbed Harold's collar and jerked it up slightly before letting him drop back into the chair with a loud clack. "You trying to be a hero?" he sneered. "You think anyone from South Ridge is going to come save you?" Brandon rolled his shoulders like warming up before a second round. He circled behind Harold, yanked the rope tighter, then stopped just beside him. "Talk or die," he said flatly, like talking about the weather. "There are no cameras here. No laws." He stood straight, leaned down to Harold's ear, and finished like driving a nail. "Only skin and my authority." Those words hit Harold like a physical weight. He felt himself shrinking, cornered with nowhere to run. The yellow light swayed slightly as wind slipped through cracks in the tin. Brandon's shadow stretched longer, spilling over Harold. He watched the police boots tapping lightly on the floor, slow and steady, the kind of rhythm that said the man had all the time in the world. "I know you heard the signal," Brandon said. "You think it's safe enough to go brag about it?" Harold tried to say he hadn't told anyone. Got the words out, just as Brandon leaned in and grabbed his shirt, pulling him back hard. "I'm not asking to hear you deny it," Brandon said. "I'm asking if anyone else heard it too." Harold shook his head. His breathing grew heavy, heart pounding like it might shatter his ribs. He knew the more he said, the more he'd get hit, so he chose his words sparingly. Brandon paced back and forth in front of him, rubbing his chin. "Old man, I'm telling you the truth. I've never understood why we're supposed to let South Ridge exist in peace," he said, his tone like a teacher lecturing. "You people stir things up without even noticing, then act all innocent when we call you on it." Harold wanted to say he'd never caused any trouble, but the words didn't make it to his lips before Brandon turned and looked at him with the kind of stare that came from someone standing at the highest rung, looking down. "Let me tell you something," he said. "This whole thing ends quickly if you open your mouth right." He leaned in close, the smell of cigarettes mixed with hot breath hitting Harold straight in the nose. "If not, you disappear before the rooster crows." End set. Harold trembled slightly, but not from the cold. It was a deeper kind of shaking, the kind that rose from the pit of the stomach, the kind of fear that had followed him for more than 40 years. Brandon saw it and gave a small smile. The smile of someone savoring the moment of power. He stepped back, hands on his hips, and asked, "So, say it. Who else heard that frequency?" Harold tried to stay calm, tried to remember exactly who he was dealing with, but his head was starting to spin from the pain pulsing at his temples. He took a breath and gave the truest answer he could. "No one. Just me. I heard it by accident." Brandon frowned, stepped forward, and raised a fist like a warning. In the warehouse, there was only Harold's breathing and the sound of Brandon's boots on the floor. The space felt sealed off. The yellow light overhead no longer felt like it illuminated anything. It felt like it exposed the weakest parts of him. Brandon tilted his head, stared at Harold a few seconds longer, then gave a dry laugh. "Old man, let's see how long that mouth of yours can hold out." And right then, Harold understood. Tonight, the law lay dead on this concrete floor, and he had been placed in the middle as the object for Brandon to test just how far the Hale family's power could go on anyone they chose. The yellow light overhead flickered once, then steadied, shining down on Harold Green's face, slick with sweat and blood. His breathing was heavy, but he forced his back to stay straight, even as the ropes cut deeper into his wrists like tearing flesh. Brandon Hale stood a few steps away, both hands resting on the grip of his baton, head tilted slightly, the kind of tilt someone gives right before peeling away the last layers of someone else's endurance. He circled slowly like a dog stalking prey, eyes scanning every small reaction Harold gave, then stopped when he caught the subtle tremble Harold was trying to hide. Brandon smiled faintly, not out of joy, but to sharpen the point of what he was about to say. "Do you remember the black kid that got killed back then?" he said, voice steady and cold. "You stood there shaking like a dog. You let him die." Each word he dropped was like a knife pressed exactly where Harold feared most, the deepest part of him he'd tried to bury for years. Brandon spoke slowly, precisely, like he was reading out an old indictment one Harold had carried for half a lifetime. "You saw him lying in the street. I heard the full story from my grandfather. You were just a few steps away and did nothing." Harold tried not to look away, but his throat tightened, heat rising from his gut and spinning his head. The shaking in him now didn't come from Brandon, or from the cold, dark warehouse. It came from the image of that young man in 71, lying in the middle of the street. Blood pooled beneath his head, body still twitching slightly, while Harold stood frozen, hands trembling, feet stuck to the ground. He used to think time had blurred that memory, but hearing Brandon say it brought it all back, clear, sharp, like it was happening in this very room. Brandon saw the shift in his eyes and pressed harder, voice firmer. "You remember him? Or do you pretend to forget, so you can sleep at night?" Harold tried to breathe, but the breath caught between pain throbbing in his temple. He couldn't speak right away, his chest clenched too tight, but what hurt most was the truth Brandon had dragged out. He was shaking, yes, but not from fear of Brandon. He shook because he hated himself, because his silence had lasted so long it had become a stain he couldn't wash off. Brandon mistook that for fear, which only made him more sure of himself. He stepped closer. "Letting that kid die at your age," he said. "You're still that stupid." Harold closed his eyes for a few seconds, then opened them again, digging deep for strength from somewhere he hadn't touched in years. He could hear his own heartbeat, the blood in his ears, even the memory crashing in. He couldn't run anymore. His voice came rough, but steady. "That day I stayed silent, and that silence killed." He swallowed hard. "I'm old now. But today, I don't stay silent." Brandon blinked not out of emotion, but because the answer didn't match what he expected. He wanted raw fear. He wanted Harold to beg, to tremble the way he was used to seeing people from South Ridge do. But Harold's words made Brandon's face stretch, then stiffen, like someone had challenged his authority to his face. Brandon raised his head slightly, one side of his mouth curling into a bitter smirk. "You think you have the right to say that to me?" he asked, voice laced with venom. "You think you can still stand tall at your age?" Harold looked him straight in the eye, not with hatred, but with the weight of a life worn down. Brandon hated that look. He stepped in close, baton gripped tight, testing the hold like checking its weight. "Let me make it clear for you, old man," he said, spitting each word. "The only reason you're still breathing is because we let you." His voice dropped lower, but hit harder. "Today, you forgot that." Brandon leaned back slightly, then raised the baton high. The yellow light glinted off the metal edge. The cement floor echoed the faint shuffle of his boot, but to Harold it sounded like a hammer hitting bone. The baton hovered above him, ready to come down with enough force to end everything. Brandon stared down at him, eyes boiling with rage, not because of who Harold was, but because Harold had dared to speak, dared to stand. "You opened your mouth at the wrong time," he said. "Now you face the consequence." Harold could feel the chill from the baton before it even touched him. His head throbbed, but his mind was suddenly clear. He had spent a lifetime dodging the past, avoiding the story of 71 like ducking a heavy shadow. But now that shadow stood right in front of him, and he knew that if he stayed silent again, he'd die just like that young man once did. He lifted his head, even though his neck screamed, eyes steady, voice tired but unwavering. "Go ahead, if that's what you think is right." The words made Brandon jerk for a beat, as if he wasn't used to hearing a black man say anything that stepped outside fear. He narrowed his eyes and tightened his grip on the baton, his hand trembling slightly from anger, not from fear of anything behind him. Brandon stepped back half a pace, then gathered force and lifted the baton higher than before. The warehouse lights flickered, and his shadow stretched across Harold like a warning of a blow strong enough to twist fate itself. Harold didn't know whether that strike would be the last, but from the way Brandon braced his shoulders, he knew the next hit would carry everything the man had. The baton held above Brandon's head paused for a single second, just one short moment, but enough for Harold to see the hatred of 2 generations of Red Willow police gathered in that stare. The moment tightened like a drawn string, still as water before a hard wind. Brandon lowered his elbow to gain more force, and in the next breath he was ready to bring down a blow that could end everything in that cold warehouse, where the law lay dead and the truth was pressed into the cement floor. Brandon's baton had just lifted when the warehouse door burst open, kicked hard from the outside. The metal slammed loud enough to shake the entire space, loud enough that Brandon froze mid-swing, even though the rage inside him hadn't burned out. Light from the hallway spilled in, slicing the room in half, and in the doorway stood a figure. Harold's eyes went wide, breath caught in his throat. That silhouette. It was too familiar for him to believe it was a mistake. Brandon turned too, his face hardening, baton still in hand, but his shoulder twitched an instinctive flinch when something outside your plan steps into view. The figure stepped forward twice, casting a long shadow across the cement floor. Tall, solid frame, black coat, dusted with road dirt like he had just come from far away. His face was sharp, all hard lines, and his eyes were so deep and cold that the temperature in the warehouse seemed to drop. Harold couldn't believe what he was seeing, but that build, that walk, it couldn't be anyone else. Every line was just as he remembered from the day he left home, only older, stronger, and carrying the weight of war behind him. Jalen Green, 33 years old. His son, declared dead by the government during an overseas mission. The son Harold thought he had lost forever, was now standing right in front of him. Brandon stared at Jalen for a second, then stumbled back a step. "Who the hell are you?" he snapped, voice sharp but laced with a flicker of panic. "Who said you could come in here?" He tightened his grip on the baton, but his hands trembled, as if his body understood the shift in power before his mind could catch up. Jalen didn't answer the question. He took another step, eyes still locked on Harold, checking if his father was still breathing. No introduction, no explanation, just 4 words, clean, heavy, cold as steel. "Where is my father?" The air in the warehouse changed the moment he spoke. That voice didn't belong to a regular man. It was the voice of someone who had faced death, who had watched teammates fall, who had been silent through missions that never made the news. That voice held back everything Jalen had lived through, and Brandon heard it clearly enough to lose the last of his confidence. He swallowed hard, eyes darting between Harold and Jalen, scrambling for a way out, but no route made sense. "You think you know who you're talking to?" Brandon tried to snap back, trying to hold his ground. But the end of his sentence slipped like someone fighting off fear and losing. Harold looked at his son, eyes wet without knowing when he'd started crying. He trembled not because of Brandon anymore, but because what stood before him was too big to take in. He had buried that grief deep, in a place no one could reach. The day he got the news that Jalen had died in the line of duty, he was so broken he couldn't even stand. And now, his son stood there, alive, breathing, and just a few steps away. Harold wanted to say his name, but all he could do was release a heavy, shaking breath. Jalen shifted his gaze to Brandon. His footsteps were steady, slow but firm, the walk of someone who had crossed battlefields. No hesitation, no breaks. "What did you do to him?" Jalen asked, his voice dropping a level, each word heavier than the last, enough to make Brandon step back again. Brandon tried to sound tough. "I'm doing my job. This has nothing to do with you." But Jalen didn't let him finish. He cut in, slower but louder. "I'll ask one last time. Where is my father?" Brandon exhaled hard, trying to appear calm. The old man tapped into a restricted frequency. I was just—" He didn't get to finish. Jalen took another half step, and it shut him up completely. The space between them now was close enough that Jalen could smell the cigarette smoke on Brandon's jacket, and Brandon could see the long scar running across Jalen's neck. A scar no ordinary man carried. That scar spoke volumes. It said Jalen wasn't afraid. And it said Brandon should be. Jalen's eyes dropped to the rope around Harold's wrists. One glance was enough to understand everything. He knelt and untied it, hands fast and sharp, trembling slightly at the end as he saw the bruises on his father's skin. "You okay, Dad?" he asked softly, in a voice that knew this wasn't the time to touch pain too directly. Harold nodded, breath shaky. You're alive." Jalen placed a hand on his father's shoulder, firm enough to steady him, gentle enough not to hurt him further. Brandon saw it and stiffened, voice rising like a man desperate to regain control. "Hey, stop!" I said, "Stop right there." He raised the baton again, but his grip wasn't steady like before. Jalen turned to face him. That look made Brandon take another step back. "Who do you think you're swinging at?" Jalen said, voice sharp and cool. "You don't even know how I got in here." Brandon blinked, eyes wild, because he knew that was true. The door hadn't been left unlocked. It had been kicked open with force, precision, and training. In Jalen's mind, every piece clicked into place fast. Tonight, Harold's radio had suddenly gone silent. The familiar crackle on frequency 67.9 vanished. That had never happened in all the years Jalen had been secretly listening. He used signal tracking skills he had learned back in Delta to trace the block transmission. The waveband had shifted west, toward an area with no houses, only old warehouses. When a patrol car appeared on the signal map, he knew something had happened to his father. Brandon swallowed hard when he saw Jalen coming closer. I don't know who you are," he said, his voice dropping half a pitch. Jalen leaned in, just inches from his face, voice dropping like stone. "Don't worry, you'll know soon." Brandon jerked backward out of instinct, hand gripping his baton, but his wrist was limp, like the strength had left it. Jalen stepped in front of him and Harold, standing tall like a wall. And in that cold, dark warehouse, Brandon understood something he had never expected. Someone in Red Willow didn't bow to him, didn't fear the Hail name, and most of all, wasn't afraid to hit back. Harold looked at his son like he was a flame igniting in the darkest room of his life. A life of being crushed, a fear buried deep for so many years, was now rising to the surface in this moment. Jalen turned to his father, his voice quiet but firm. "My father is not dying here. In that warehouse," those words hit harder than any punch, and Brandon, for the first time in his life, felt the cold of real fear run from the back of his neck down his spine. The moment Brandon Hale saw Jalen Green standing in front of him, he tried to summon his old bravado, tried to look like the same man in control, but his body betrayed him first. The hand gripping the baton trembled with each breath. His shoulders pulled in like someone who had just missed a step in the dark. He stepped back half a pace, then planted a hand on his hip, pretending he still held authority. But Jalen's eyes followed him closely, and Brandon knew one slip, and he wasn't leaving this warehouse upright. Jalen glanced at his father for a second to make sure Harold was still conscious, then turned back to Brandon. In that instant, the entire dynamic flipped. Brandon raised the baton out of reflex, but Jalen moved faster, so fast that the sound of his boots came quicker than Brandon's next gasp. One hand locked around Brandon's wrist, twisted sharply in the opposite direction. A clean, practiced move, fast and forceful enough to make Brandon cry out through clenched teeth. His arm folded into an unnatural angle, muscles twitching from pain. Before he could pull away, Jalen stepped in behind him, spun his entire body, locked his arm, and slammed him down onto the concrete floor. 5 seconds. That's all it took. So fast Harold barely registered what his son had done. Brandon lay face down, arms pinned behind his back, cheek pressed against the cold cement, breathing like a trapped animal. Jalen pinned an elbow into his back, just enough pressure to stop him from moving yet still left room for him to speak. Brandon wheezed, struggling to catch his breath. Jalen leaned closer, his voice low, cold, and calm enough that every word hit harder than bone on concrete. Name the one behind it. No yelling, no threats. It was the voice of someone trained to get answers without raising volume, and that calmness made Brandon freeze. I don't know who you are. Brandon stammered, voice cracking. Jalen pushed his elbow in deeper, making Brandon jolt violently. His breath cut off for a beat. Name, Jalen repeated. Brandon tried to lift his face from the cement, but Jalen shoved his shoulder back down, forcing a grunt out of him like a man kicked in the gut. Talk! And Brandon gasped for air like someone drowning, then blurted out, Holloway! Holloway gave the order! He spoke fast, panicked, as if even a few more seconds of pressure would tear his shoulder from the socket. That name spilled from his mouth like surrender. But in the cold warehouse, it rang out like a piece of steel dropped onto iron. Jalen went still, his hand on Brandon's shoulder eased off slightly, but his grip remained firm. His eyes shifted not in surprise, but in confirmation of something he'd suspected for a long time. Jalen leaned in close to Brandon's ear, his breath brushing the man's neck. His voice dropped lower, deep enough to make Brandon shiver. Good, Jalen said. I'm looking for him too. That made Brandon hiss through his teeth. In that moment, he understood Jalen hadn't come here just to save some old man. He had come to drag out every secret hidden behind the name Holloway, the name Brandon once thought no one dared touch. He tried to turn his head, but Jalen didn't let him. With a swift motion, Jalen kicked Brandon's baton aside, then reached down and removed the man's gun from its holster, like pulling a drawer he'd opened 100 times. Harold watched, equal parts frightened and amazed. His son didn't move like an ordinary man. The way he gripped Brandon's wrist, turned his body, locked the arm, then drove him to the floor, it all bore the signature of someone from a unit no one wanted to face. Harold stared at the shape of Jalen's back, saw the steady rise and fall of his breath, calm, controlled, not like a man who had just fought, but like someone simply doing what he'd been trained to do, protect his own and clear the path. Brandon still writhed beneath him, but every motion sent a sharp crack through his shoulder that shut him up fast. You don't know what this is about, he hissed. Jalen leaned down, his eyes so cold even Harold felt a chill. Then tell me, Jalen replied. Let's hear how much you really know. Brandon panted hard, his face smeared against the dirty concrete, hands shaking. I was just following orders, he stuttered. We were just taking care of people flagged as threats. Jalen pushed down on his shoulder again, cutting off the end of the sentence with a strangled gasp. What kind of threat? Jalen asked. A threat for hearing a radio? Or a threat for daring to exist? Brandon held his breath, then choked out the words like a man with nowhere left to go. Holloway said that neighborhood needed control. We got the order last week. He paused, then added in a voice barely louder than a dying breeze. This old man. He heard us. Holloway said to deal with him first. Harold heard it, and pain shot through his chest like something being twisted. Jalen heard it and fell silent, not out of restraint, but like a storm gathering its strength. Deal with him first, Jalen repeated slowly, like carving the words into Brandon's skull. Brandon trembled. Cold sweat seeped into the concrete under his cheek. In the warehouse, there was only the sound of Brandon's heavy breathing and the faint creak of the rope still swaying from the last yank that had tied Harold down. Jalen stood up, keeping his foot pressed against Brandon's back so he couldn't get up. He leaned down close to Brandon's face one last time, his voice thin but solid as steel. You dragged my father out here. You beat him, you threatened him, and you thought I'd let that slide? Brandon opened his mouth to speak, but Jalen tilted his head, and the look in his eyes shut him up instantly. Holloway sent you, Jalen continued. So you go back and tell him one thing. Jalen leaned in even closer, his words dropping right by Brandon's ear, slow and heavy. I'm here! And if for Brandon heard that, and his whole body curled in on itself like a cold had just shot through his bones. He used to think he had power in this West Side warehouse, used to think the Hale family could do whatever they wanted. But with his face pinned to the cement floor, under the weight of the man he thought was long gone, Brandon understood that something truly broke tonight. Not bones, something deeper. The belief he'd carried since childhood, that white men in Red Willow couldn't be touched. And for the first time in his life, he knew he was losing. Jalen kept his foot pressed on Brandon's back for a few more seconds to make sure he wouldn't try anything, then stepped over to Harold. He knelt down, carefully loosening each knot of the rope biting into his father's wrists. His hands were steady, but they trembled slightly at the sight of the red marks cut deep into Harold's skin. When the ropes finally slipped free, Harold collapsed forward, and Jalen caught him just in time, both arms wrapping under his father's to hold up the weight of a body too tired to stay upright. Harold leaned into his son's shoulder, his body trembling like a pulled string, tears falling without a sound. He didn't even hear himself cry, only ragged, broken breaths echoing from his chest. He had held himself together through the worst years, but this moment broke him into pieces. Harold gripped Jalen's shoulder, trying to steady his breathing, but the words came out before he could stop them. I pulled you into this, he choked out, eyes still red from the heat of tears. I wasn't supposed to live this long. The words were soaked in the guilt of a father who had survived when maybe he shouldn't have. He once believed he'd paid enough for his silence back in '71. But life, it turned out, had more to collect. He didn't think his life was worth another scar on his son. Jalen held his shoulder firmly, lifting him slightly, just enough to remind him he was still standing. No, Jalen said, voice solid as stone. They pulled you in. His eyes locked on Harold's hard, but not without gentleness. The kind of softness Jalen reserved only for family. You didn't start this. They dragged you in because they thought South Ridge was easy to break. He leaned in a little, his voice quieter now, but deeper, and they will pay for that. His face showed no hesitation, no fear, only the certainty of someone who had already faced death and come back. This wasn't a promise made in anger. It was a vow made by a man who had given his life to the word protect. Harold wanted to respond, but his throat burned too much to speak. So he only nodded, his aged eyes staring at his son with a mix of gratitude and fear that tomorrow might take him away again. Jalen helped him sit down in another chair, then turned back toward Brandon. The man was still face down on the floor, breathing heavily, trying to twist his head to see what Jalen was doing. Every time he managed to lift it slightly, Jalen met his eyes with a look that sent him back into the concrete. Jalen crouched beside him without a word for a few seconds. He reached for the gun and baton, then let his eyes drift to Brandon's chest pocket. A silver security badge peeked out, its metal glint catching the yellow light. Brandon saw Jalen looking at it and broke into a shaky voice. Don't. That has nothing to do with you. His words were weak, like he already knew the truth had just become more dangerous than any blow. Jalen didn't reply. He simply leaned in and slid the badge out with 2 fingers, studying it for a beat as if memorizing every detail. The Red Willow town seal was lightly embossed across its surface. Next to it was an internal access code, a clearance Brandon had been granted to enter buildings off-limits to civilians, especially those connected to Holloway. Brandon tried to raise his head again, but Jalen pressed a foot to his back to remind him this moment wasn't his. Don't, Brandon said again, voice stripped of all his former aggression. You don't understand. Jalen leaned down to his ear, voice smooth and cold like melting ice. I understand more than you think. Then he stood, slowly turning the badge in his hand before letting it rest in his palm like a new weapon. Harold saw it. He didn't ask questions. But in his gut, he knew that badge was the key to something far bigger than being rescued from this warehouse. Brandon breathed hard, his whole body shaking like the strength had been drained from him. He watched Jalen pocket the badge, and his eyes widened as he realized this could be the thing that shattered the mountain of power Holloway had used to hide the truth for years. "You're killing yourself," he rasped, though the words carried no threat. Jalen didn't look back. He slid the badge into his jacket and answered, voice so low Harold had to lean in to hear it. "No, I'm clearing the way. I'm to end." Harold looked at his son and saw something familiar in his eyes, the same fire he'd seen in the eyes of men long ago. Men who knew there were truths bigger than themselves that needed to be exposed. Jalen returned to his side, checking that he could stand, placing a steady hand on his shoulder again. Brandon lay on the ground, staring up at the two of them with the helpless disbelief of someone who couldn't understand how quickly the power had shifted from absolute control to being pinned beneath someone else's boot. Harold leaned against the wall, his breathing a little steadier. Jalen stood close beside him, eyes still locked on Brandon like a guard watching a prisoner. In the cold warehouse, the earlier tension had transformed into a strange kind of silence, the silence of a father handing his life over to his son, and the silence of a man realizing he was never untouchable. Jalen turned slightly toward his father and said, just loud enough for only the two of them to hear, "You're done. I'll take it from here." And Harold understood. The moment Jalen picked up that security badge was the second Red Willow's fate started to shift into something no one could predict. The next morning, before South Ridge had fully woken up, trouble had already arrived. Eddie, Harold Green's old friend, was riding his rusty bicycle past the stretch near the gas station, the spot where police often lurked waiting to catch someone slipping. A patrol car came up behind him, flashing its headlights repeatedly, then veered straight toward Eddie like it meant to force him off the road. Eddie braked hard, the bike wobbled, and he tumbled headfirst into the ditch. The sound of bone-hitting pavement was so clear that people nearby felt a chill run down their spines. Eddie clutched his arm, his face pale as ash, his hand twisted at an angle no human bone should bend. The two officers in the car looked at him for a few seconds, then drove off, no questions, no medics, no help. To them, the job was done. To the people of South Ridge, it was the police saying, "We'll do whatever we want." Not even an hour later, the news of Eddie being run off the road spread through the neighborhood. People gathered outside the barber shop, murmuring among themselves. One woman blurted out, her voice shaking with anger, "They think we're animals or something." A man stood with arms crossed, leaning against a wall, watching the dust blow down the street, his voice lower but bitter in every word. "They don't think it. They've known it for a long time." South Ridge was used to being mistreated, but this morning's incident added fuel to a pot that had been simmering for years. Rage spread like wind, sweeping through rows of worn-out homes. The young men on the corner reacted like someone flipped a switch. They started talking about the night before, how they saw a patrol car heading toward the warehouse, how Harold vanished until just before dawn when someone helped him back into his house. No one knew the full details, but folks in South Ridge didn't need an official report to figure out what had gone down. There weren't many facts, but there was plenty of anger. "Harold got taken," one of them said. "We heard the engines all night." Another added, "And now they come for Eddie?" Too perfect. No one said it outright, but everyone knew these two events were tied like points on the same thread. And that thread led back to one place, the Red Willow Police Department. In small kitchens, adults sat close together, whispering over coffee. Mothers kept their voices low, afraid the kids might hear and get scared. But the worry was all over their faces. A thin old man, elbows on his knees, sighed. "They're sending a message." First Harold, now Eddie. No one replied. But the silence wasn't the comforting kind. It was the quiet, before a storm. Everyone knew Southridge had been enduring for a long time, but enduring didn't mean blind. By noon, the story had grown bigger. Someone walking past the market said they'd seen Harold's face bruised and swollen. Another said there were bloodstains by his fence and tire tracks from a patrol car in the soft dirt. The details got twisted and added to, but the core truth stayed the same. The police had laid hands on the kindest old man in the neighborhood. When Harold, the man who avoided trouble his entire life, got attacked, Southridge understood clearly. If even he wasn't safe, then no one was. Word spread so fast that by the afternoon, repair shops, corner stores, and small markets had all turned into places of discussion. Someone banged their fist on a counter, their voice sharp with frustration. "They've gone too far." A woman with a grocery bag, eyes red from fury, muttered, "Who's next tomorrow?" The question hung in the air. No one could answer. Southridge felt the weight of that day like a load pressing down on someone already trying just to stand upright. When the anger grew too big to hide, the local press started sniffing around and headed for City Hall. They came with questions, but police officers stood thick at the entrance, faces cold and blank like someone had glued the same expression to each of them. That's when Bradley Holloway appeared, like he'd been waiting for the spotlight. He stepped into the middle of the reporters with the same friendly smile he'd worn for years. He raised the microphone, adjusted his jacket, and spoke in a voice smooth as syrup. "Fake news. Sometimes the elderly imagine things." The reporters fell silent for a few seconds, like they were trying to process what he'd just said. He went on. "Mr. Green is an old man. Sometimes exhaustion makes people think things happened when they didn't. These recent rumors are completely false." He spoke without blinking, his mouth smiling while his eyes stayed flat. "The Red Willow Police Department always follows proper procedure," he added, like reciting a line from a script. Back in Southridge, those words spread faster than wind. People heard them and laughed dry laughter without joy, only exhaustion and rage. Eddie lay at home with his arm in a cast. Harold's face was still swollen, and yet Holloway stood at the town podium telling everyone they were imagining things. An old woman on the corner heard the news and shook her head slowly, like someone who had seen too much in life. "He thinks we're stupid," she said. A man beside her replied, "No, he knows we're poor, so he thinks we'll stay quiet." But that afternoon, Southridge was not quiet. The anger had become a low hum on every street, from the old men on their porches to the teens standing along the curb. Everyone could feel it. Red Willow was changing. And this time, it wasn't the color of fresh paint. It was the color of truth, long buried, now starting to break through in every painful story echoing from their streets. On the day Southridge burned like coal meeting flame, Jalen Green sat in the small room at his father's house, yellow light from an old bulb casting shadows over the scars on his cheek like traces of survival. He placed the security badge he had taken from Brandon Hale's uniform on the table and stared at it longer than he needed to. Part of him wanted to smash it to pieces out of rage, but the greater part knew objects like this weren't made to be broken. They were keys, and keys only mattered when used at the right time. Jalen looked over at Harold. His father had fallen asleep in the chair, arms wrapped around his stomach like he was holding in his breath. His face looked gaunt, aged more in one night than it should have in a year. Seeing that, Jalen understood something more clearly than any radio had ever taught him about survival. Fighting in the dark meant playing by Red Willow police rules. Fighting in the dark let them choose the place, the time, the method to make innocent people disappear without a question asked. In that kind of war zone, only the dirty ones win. Jalen took a deep breath, laid his hand flat on the table, and spoke low but sharp. "No, I'm dragging you bastards into the light. Let your people see exactly what you are." He stood up and picked up the badge. A man raised under military command knew that to strike a big target, you had to map the movements of the ones closest to it. Brandon Hale wasn't the mastermind, but he was a side door. Jalen sat down, opened the old laptop he'd kept since leaving the service, and started scanning the internal data from the badge. Some sections were locked, but a few were still accessible. Jalen found Brandon's detailed schedule. Duty days, shift changes, assignments, patrol routes. Information like that meant nothing in regular hands, but to someone trained in infiltration techniques with Delta, it was a map to track the real power behind the abuse. Jalen leaned back, eyes fixed on the text on the screen. Brandon was regularly tasked with transporting documents from the police station to an office building near downtown. That building belonged to a subsidiary of Bradford Holloway, a name Jalen had just heard spill from Brandon's mouth in the West Side warehouse. That wasn't coincidence. And it wasn't small. If there was any place hiding evidence, that was it. Harold shifted in his sleep, drawing Jalen's glance for a second before he looked back at the screen. He remembered Brandon being slammed to the concrete floor, gasping out the word Holloway, like even the Hale family feared that name. For Jalen, that wasn't a warning. It was confirmation he was on the right path. He pulled his chair closer, opened his notebook, and began sketching out the times Brandon typically entered and left the building. Once, twice, 3 times a week, always in the afternoon. He didn't need to say it aloud, but the mission had already taken shape in his mind. Jalen opened the window and looked out. South Ridge was quiet tonight, but quiet in the way a place gets after something heavy. No laughter, no kids running around. Just that weight in the air that every long-time resident recognized, the kind that settles when the black community gets cornered. They didn't shout. They moved step by step. Jalen knew that silence well. He had grown up inside it. He had left town for years, but never forgot the way Red Willow squeezed the breath out of the people on the south side. He touched the window frame, closed his eyes, drew in a long breath, then turned back. Decision sealed. "You want to play in the dark," he said to himself, just loud enough to hear. "I'll bring you out in front of the whole town." He wasn't speaking in anger. He was calm. Jalen knew this could lead him into something more dangerous than any mission he had ever taken with Delta. But he also knew something else. If he didn't do this, Harold Green wouldn't live much longer in a Red Willow where beating old men was just another part of morning exercise. Jalen grabbed his jacket, slipped the security badge into his pocket, and looked at Harold one last time before stepping out of the room. He locked the door gently, made sure his father's breathing was steady. Then he walked into the backyard, where the darkness covered the path. But this time, he didn't fear the dark. He used it as a place to begin. In Jalen's mind, every step was clear like a mission plan. He would follow Brandon on the day he visited Holloway's office. He would wait until the documents were delivered, then use the badge to access the biometric door. He would search for proof, files, records, anything that tied the surveillance of the black neighborhoods to Holloway and the police force. The goal wasn't just to bring down Brandon. The goal was to tear the rotten guts of Red Willow out into the daylight where no one could deny it anymore. Jalen moved toward the narrow alley beside the house, the path where he wouldn't be seen. He zipped his jacket up tight, eyes focused on downtown, where Holloway had built his office with money he called community support. To someone like Jalen, that wasn't a building. That was the nest of the snake. He exhaled slowly, a line repeating in his head like a vow. "Let your people see exactly what you are." And he started walking, without looking back. Jalen Green had followed Brandon Hale's work schedule for 2 days, watching him come and go from Holloway's office, building a sleek block of concrete sitting in the center of Red Willow. To the average citizen, it meant nothing, but to someone with special forces training like Jalen, the place gave off signals he could read instantly. It was the kind of building that had guards, security systems, and something inside meant to stay hidden. When Brandon entered one afternoon like he always did, Jalen kept his distance, watched him pass through the revolving door, and memorized the speed of his badge swipe and the location of the fingerprint scanner beside it. After Brandon was inside, Jalen circled to the back of the building where there was a side door for internal staff. He pulled out Brandon's gun, the one he had taken from him at the West Side warehouse, and gently wiped the side, where a greasy fingerprint still clung to the metal. For Jalen, a fingerprint didn't need to be scanned directly. One clean print on a metal surface was enough to trick the older model readers used in Red Willow. He pressed the side of the gun against the scanner and held it there. A green light blinked faintly, like a breath. Then the door gave a soft click, quiet enough that most people wouldn't notice. But to Jalen, it was loud, as a lock breaking open. The door cracked open. Jalen slipped through, body sliding into the narrow gap. The room inside was lit with cold white light, the polished tile floor echoing every step he took. He walked straight down the hall to the right, the one he had seen Brandon disappear into after delivering documents. At the end of the hallway was the data room, its door made of frosted glass, and a badge scanner mounted on the left. Jalen swiped Brandon's badge once. The machine responded smoothly, and the door opened like it had been waiting for the right person. Inside, the air smelled of electronics and paper dust. Rows of tall filing cabinets lined the walls, servers ran along the edges, and network cables spilled across the floor like spiderwebs. Jalen had seen plenty of rooms like this in the military, but this one felt different. It felt like the kind of place no one ever wanted exposed. He sat down in front of the main server, plugged in a slim device he had brought shaped like a USB stick, but containing software once used to extract data from abandoned overseas bases. Within seconds, folders began to appear on the screen, one after another. Jalen scrolled through the list, his eyes only stopping when he reached the heavy files, the ones with names too suspicious to be public. Surveillance map, budget expansion, South Ridge priority zones, and one massive folder labeled Weapons Pipeline. He opened them one by one. The data poured out fast as water. A surveillance map of the black neighborhoods appeared, with red dots marking homes, camera routes, and streets labeled as pressure points. The weapons documents trace supply lines running from other states into Red Willow through companies owned by Holloway. Internal emails between Chief Mills and Holloway showed a silent agreement in tone: neutralize risk, protect the community, priority enforcement rights. Jalen gripped the keyboard tighter when he read the phrase community control operations, knowing exactly what it was. Not a civil program, but a suppression campaign hidden under polite language. At the bottom, a small folder blinked with dual-layer protection. He typed in the unlock command. A few seconds passed, then it opened. File name, Operation Redline. Jalen froze when he saw it. He hadn't even opened the file, but his heart skipped a beat. Redline was a term he hadn't heard since the foreign battlefield, the day he lost 3 teammates, the day the mission report called it a failure due to internal malfunction. He thought he was mistaken, but there it was, letters on the screen, clear as the scar on his neck. He opened the file. The first page came up with a line of text, so cold he felt like he was reading a death report. The operation to deploy Delta Team along a false route was meant to clear the way for the shipment to reach Red Willow. Jalen sat frozen, eyes scanning each line while his mind felt like it was being held back. The following reports detailed a weapons shipment moved at the exact time his team was redirected in the opposite direction. They were deployed based on false intelligence information sent from an address linked to one of Holloway's shell companies. The last part of the file listed the entities that benefited from Delta Team being misled. Among them were businesses in Red Willow that had previously received special security funding. The final name stood apart, as if trying to hide, but was the clearest of all. Bradford Holloway. Jalen leaned back in his chair, exhaling slow and deep. The old pain, what he thought he had buried in the sand, when he left the service jerked back to life. He remembered his teammates' eyes before they went down, remembered the sound of fire exploding beside him, remembered the moment he thought he'd die too, but somehow crawled back to the extraction point. He used to believe the battlefield betrayed him, but the one who betrayed his team was standing in a quiet town, in the middle of America, under a sign that read, "For the community." The fear of surviving is the fear of not dying at the right time and having to see the truth too late. Jalen knew that better than anyone. He took a breath, steadying his hands. The folders were still open, data still streaming, evidence piling up against Holloway and the Red Willow police, flooding the screen. Jalen looked at it, and his eyes no longer held just anger. This was silence hardened into resolve, the resolve of someone who understood that his life had been spared not to keep running. In the cold room, under the steady hum of the fan, Jalen said something just loud enough for himself to hear, "Holloway, I found you." The day Jalen Green extracted the data from Holloway's office was also the day Red Willow woke up in a more distorted version of itself. That morning, the local newspaper hit the stands early with a bold front-page headline, "Black elderly man disrupts town security." All of South Ridge froze when they saw it. Some squinted. Others cursed under their breath. The article described Harold Green as a gullible man, imagining conspiracies, spreading community panic, and injuring himself while resisting law enforcement. Not a single word matched what had really happened. But in Red Willow, the press under Holloway's control always wrote like that, as if black folks were blurry outlines they could redraw however they pleased. By midday, Red Willow police launched a new control campaign. Patrol cars filled the corners of South Ridge. Officers stood in the streets with that look of picking a fight. They stopped black drivers at random, asked for papers without giving reasons, then demanded trunks and bags be opened, searching under suspicion. A high schooler driving his mother's car to class got pulled over tight against the curb, the officer slapping the roof like the kid had committed a felony. The mother rushed out yelling, asking what was going on. The officer answered with a cold, clipped line, "New rules. Random check." South Ridge residents stood watching, angry with nowhere to aim it. Harold Green watched the cops pass his house all day, his heart burning like coal in a furnace. He kept the door locked, stood behind the curtain. After the night in the West Side warehouse, his body hurt too much to move easily. But what bothered him more was the feeling of being watched, monitored like a criminal. He heard the patrol car drive by at least 10 times, heard the radio chatter from their speakers repeating, "High-risk zone, maintain surveillance." He didn't need to guess which zone they meant. Downtown, Holloway was in a meeting with his inner circle. The conference room gleamed, a long polished wooden table reflecting the overhead lights. Holloway stood at the head, hands on the table, voice low but full of control. "That Green kid is sniffing around the office," he said, eyes scanning each face in the room. "He's not like the usual black guys in South Ridge." Someone asked, "What do you want to do about him?" Holloway responded instantly, voice sharp as a blade. "Get him, at any cost." He didn't hide the contempt in his voice when he said, "him," as if Jalen were lint on his suit. But it wasn't hate. What really burned Holloway was that Jalen made him feel exposed. He wasn't used to being seen past the mask. Until now, Holloway had always controlled the narrative with money and connections. But what happened at the West Side warehouse made it clear someone had breached the walls he built. And he couldn't let that continue. Police Chief Mills was in the room, holding a slim file. "That one was Delta," Mills said, with a trace of concern in his voice. "He won't be easy." Holloway shot him a cold glance. "Delta or not, he's still a black man in Red Willow. That's reason enough." The room went silent for a few seconds. Mills nodded. He understood. In this town, all it took was a sentence from Holloway to justify any move. By evening, 3 black SUVs rolled onto South Ridge's main street. They moved slow, lights off, but stuck out easily. They didn't belong to this part of town. They stopped outside Harold's house just after dark. The engines idled all night, a quiet but unmistakable warning. "We're watching." Harold sat inside, hearing the engines hum at his door, and the chill crawled down his spine. Every time he tried to stand and move toward the window, the pain from the bruises pulled at his legs and forced him to lean on the wall to keep from falling. But still, he pulled the curtain slightly aside and looked into the dark. The 3 SUVs were lined up, interior lights off, black-tinted windows hiding everything. He couldn't see who was inside or where they were looking, but he felt the eyes from inside those cars, cold and distant like a kind of shadow you couldn't chase away. Harold swallowed hard. He knew this wasn't for him. This was a message to Jalen. A Holloway kind of message, nothing said out loud, but loud enough for the whole block to know who was holding the leash. Jalen Green stood at the back door, his shadow stretching across the dirt. He gripped the security badge tightly in his hand, eyes fixed on the street where the black SUVs sat quiet, like animals waiting for a command. "They're looking for me," Jalen said. His voice so low Harold had to tilt his head to hear. Harold answered, weak but clear. "They won't stop." Jalen nodded. "Then neither will I." Out there, the engines kept rumbling in warning, and for the first time in years, Red Willow had 2 sides staring each other down in the dark, one using money and power to twist the truth's neck, the other using mind and pain to rip the town's rotten guts onto the table. And that night, all of South Ridge knew. There was no going back to safety anymore. The town council meeting that day was so crowded that there wasn't even standing room left in the city hall hallway. People from South Ridge had come after hearing that Jalen Green would be there. Residents from the white neighborhoods also showed up, some standing with arms crossed, stern-faced, others watching from a distance with curious eyes. On stage, the town council was about to begin when the large doors opened. Everyone nearby turned, and the sight that met them made the entire room seem to stop breathing. Jalen Green walked in, shoulders square, eyes straight ahead. In his right hand, he held a pair of handcuffs, the chain dragging Brandon Hale behind him. Brandon was cuffed at the wrists in front of his body, his face bruised and swollen, uniform rumpled, walking unsteadily like someone whose sense of certainty had just been smashed into the ground. A wave of murmurs swept through the room. A white woman asked her husband, "What is this?" A black man standing behind whispered, "That's the guy who beat Harold." None of the council members had time to react, because Jalen was already making his way to the center of the room, dragging Brandon like a sack of concrete. Jalen stopped in the middle of the room, just under the Town Hall Red Willow banner. He yanked the cuffs hard, making Brandon collapse onto the front row seat. No one said a word. The police officers lining the walls looked at each other, hands on their gun belts, but too afraid to draw. Partly because Jalen was too close, and partly because everyone had heard the rumors he used to be Delta. Facing someone like that in a closed room would be suicide. The town council stood frozen, staring at Jalen like a sudden storm had ripped the roof off their house. Jalen pulled out his phone and plugged it into the projector. The large screen behind the council lit up. A video started playing, the audio ringing out across the breathless room. It showed Brandon inside the West warehouse, standing in front of Harold Green, who was tied up. His voice filled the room. "Old man, I'm asking you nicely once." The sound of him spitting landed sharp and clear. Then came the scene where Brandon raised his baton, striking Harold on the shoulder. His voice hissed, "Who told you to stick your nose in white folks' business?" A sharp gasp escaped someone's lips as the footage showed Brandon yanking Harold's head backward. The room, though packed, felt vacuum-sealed. A woman in the front row put her hand over her mouth. A white man muttered under his breath, "Jesus Christ." People from South Ridge in the back turned to each other, their eyes blazing with fury. Those who had doubted Harold's claims as exaggerated suddenly felt the truth stuck in their throat. The video wasn't gossip. It was raw truth, playing out right there in the town hall, beyond the reach of Red Willow's police to erase. Brandon trembled like he had a fever, trying to shout as the video ended. "I was just following orders," he yelled, voice cracking from fear. "I didn't act alone. I was under direct command." The words spilled out like the last plea of a man who'd just lost the roof over his head. The council buzzed with alarm. One member called out, "Who gave the order?" Brandon's eyes darted around the room, landing on the corner where Chief Mills was standing. But he didn't dare point. His face twisted like a man torn between two deaths, telling the truth or sinking with the system. Jalen stepped closer, still gripping the cuffs, leaning in near Brandon's face. "Louder," he said, not yelling, but loud enough that the whole room could catch every word. "Let them hear who gave the order." That sentence landed like a slap across every person who had ever believed this system was clean. Brandon scanned the room, sweat glistening in his hair. He opened his mouth but couldn't speak. His throat locked up, knowing that once he said it, there was no going back. The people of Southridge packed shoulder to shoulder at the door, every eye locked on Brandon. A black man in the back shouted, "Say it! You hit Mr. Harold. You said all that in the warehouse. Now say it again." Brandon lowered his head, his shoulders shaking. Chief Mills stood to the right of the council dais, his face pulled tight as a wire. Jalen glanced at him briefly, then turned back to Brandon and yanked the chain so hard that Brandon cried out. The whole room seemed to tense into silence. Brandon gasped for air, then finally forced out a single name. "Holloway!" He said it like ripping his own chest open. "Holloway told us to do it. I was just following orders." The room exploded. People shot up from their seats, pointed at the council, shouted, "I knew it!" swore out loud. A white woman in the front row covered her face and cried she had voted for Holloway 5 years straight. Holloway wasn't in the room, but just saying his name out loud in front of hundreds was enough to rip the mask off every uniform in the building. The council scrambled to restore order, but no one was listening. It all cracked open like a dam bursting in storm season. Jalen didn't react to the chaos. He stood tall, unplugged his phone from the projector. Then he walked over to his father, placed a hand on Harold's shoulder, and quietly said, "You see, Dad? Light always strips away what they try to hide." Harold looked at his son with eyes full of emotion, while Brandon, still in cuffs, bowed his head into his hands. Knowing the entire town of Red Willow had just heard the truth he spent his whole life burying. And for the first time in years, the Red Willow Town Council was burned open by the truth, right in the center of their own hall. The meeting room still echoed with the chaos left behind by Brandon Hale's testimony, but when he opened his mouth again, the entire space went quiet like someone had flipped off the air. Brandon stood between two officers who had moved in to restrain him, his legs shaking so badly his knees nearly buckled. His lips were purple, breath broken. He looked around the room and saw black faces, white faces, old and young, all staring at him like they were looking at guilt-made flesh. Brandon swallowed dryly. Then his voice came out, no longer stiff, no longer carrying the bravado of the Hale family, just raw fear. "I tortured an innocent old man." The words dropped like heavy metal hitting the floor. The entire room skipped a beat. Even the people in the back heard every syllable. A black woman clutched her chest and broke into sobs, like the confession had torn open a wound she had carried her whole life. A man standing beside Harold Green wiped away tears quietly, because that sentence wasn't just for Harold, it was for everyone South Ridge had ever lost. Even the white people in the room, those who had always trusted the police without question, lowered their heads. They had just witnessed something they could no longer deny, they had ignored for too long. Police Chief Mills stood near the podium, his face pale like all the blood had drained from it. He looked at Brandon, then at the crowd, then turned to the town council with dazed eyes like a man hit in the back of the head. He understood exactly what that sentence meant. Once an officer publicly admitted to torturing an innocent person, the entire system in Red Willow from top to bottom stood at the edge of collapse. And Mills, though he hadn't said a word, showed panic in every movement. In the short breaths between Brandon's words, the town council signaled the nearest officers. Two stepped forward and handcuffed Brandon again, like the act of cuffing him was a way to strip him of the power he had once used to crush others. They positioned him right beneath the giant banner strung across the meeting room. "Police protects the community." The slogan gleamed with fresh polish, updated yearly, a promise they always repeated in front of the press. But today, seeing Brandon cuffed beneath those words sent a chill through everyone watching. A white woman in the front row raised her hand to her mouth, stunned by the contradiction right in front of her. The people of South Ridge stared with a mix of painful relief, because justice coming late still made them remember all the ones who never lived to see it. Brandon hung his head, hair falling over his forehead, breath quick and uneven like a man about to collapse. A black student in the back whispered to his mother, "Mom, that line's never been true." She held his hand, eyes red, and answered, "Today it means something, because that boy's in cuffs under it." No one laughed. This wasn't a moment of joy. It was truth, dragging a chair into the middle of the room and forcing everyone to look. At that moment, a town employee standing near the council podium bent down to pick up a sheet of paper that had fallen behind the banner. She meant to place it back where it belonged, but when she unfolded it, her face went pale. The paper wasn't routine documentation. It was a faded printout of a project no one in the room had heard of. She read the header, swallowed hard, and handed it to the person beside her. That person read it, frowned, and passed it along. Within seconds, the paper reached the town council president. He looked down, face tightening, then raised it high for the entire room to see. The ink was faint, but everyone could make out the title, South Ridge Surveillance Project. The entire room erupted like someone had struck a live wire. People from South Ridge shouted with fury, because now they had direct evidence of what they had suspected their whole lives. White residents were shaken too, because the project proved Red Willow had been monitoring its own citizens in an organized, deliberate system. The town council froze. This wasn't about a rogue officer anymore. This was an official program approved, signed off, and buried out of sight. And the most horrifying part: South Ridge was the only target. Harold Green stood beside Jalen, his body trembling but his eyes burning bright. He looked at the paper, then at Brandon in handcuffs, then at the eyes of the hundreds of people in the room. Jalen placed a hand on his back to steady him. Harold spoke softly, his voice old but steady. "They can't hide it anymore, son." Chief Mills stepped forward to say something, but the voices from South Ridge drowned him out. "How long have we been watched? What are we in your eyes? You call this protection?" The questions crashed forward like waves, raw and real, and nothing could stop them. In the middle of all that fury, Brandon looked up, eyes wide like someone who had just lost his last anchor. For the first time in his life, he realized no member of the Hale family could pull him out of this. He was no longer a cop, no longer respected, no longer anything but a criminal standing under a banner that read, "Police protects the community," while the evidence at his feet said the exact opposite. That night, Red Willow was no longer the Red Willow it had been the day before, and Brandon Hale, the man who believed he was untouchable, collapsed completely in the very room where he once believed the whole town stood behind him. 3 days after Brandon broke down right in front of the town council, Red Willow was no longer just the business of a small town. The news spread to Washington like fire riding the wind. A black congressman from the neighboring state, after seeing the video of Harold Green's torture, demanded an emergency federal hearing within the week. That day, the hearing room was packed. The media lined up outside the building. Everyone knowing this wasn't just about one officer beating a citizen, it was about a whole system that swallowed data, hid weapons, and crushed black communities under the banner of public safety. Jalen Green sat in the back row, cap pulled low, trying not to draw attention. Harold Green had a seat closer to the witness section, assisted by staff, his body still in pain. At the podium, the committee chair opened a thick file and spoke without preamble. "We are going to examine evidence suggesting a local businessman used the town's police force to carry out unlawful surveillance and weapons transport." The room shifted. The sound of pens dropping onto desks rang out. The first slide appeared on the large screen. It was the weapons trafficking network diagram Jalen had taken from Holloway's office. Arrows traced routes from out-of-state weapon warehouses through shell company distribution centers, all leading to Red Willow. An investigator read the lines slowly. This supply route was disguised as industrial shipments. The final recipient, according to documentation, is a company called Holloway Security Solutions. Someone in the room blurted out, "Dear God." The committee chair struck the gavel, calling for order. Next came the emails. Exchanges between Chief Mills and Holloway displayed page after page. Increase pressure on South Ridge. Monitor high-risk individuals. Ensure shipment arrives on schedule. It was obvious to everyone they weren't just acquaintances, they were co-conspirators. The phrase, community protection, in the emails now felt like a sick joke. The next slide made the entire room lean forward. A map titled, "Surveilled Black Neighborhoods" appeared, dotted with hundreds of red marks. Each mark represented a South Ridge residence. Each connecting line pointed to a surveillance camera or frequency checkpoint. The words, "Priority Zone," ran across half the map. The black people in the room exhaled sharply, like taking a punch to the gut. An elderly black woman spoke out, unable to hold back. "They track us like animals." No one stopped her. The whole room was choking on their own version of the same pain. A young white congressman stood and asked the investigative team, "Is there proof this map was personally authorized?" The investigator replied, "Yes." He clicked to the next slide. On the screen appeared the digital signature of Bradford Holloway. The atmosphere turned solid, like the air had frozen. People whispered, "He actually signed it." A civil rights attorney, in the middle row, clenched his fist. The committee chair's voice scraped through the room. "Next." The final slide came up. The title at the top of the document froze the room. Operation Redline. Jalen felt his hands tighten, but he stayed still. The air dropped out of the room like someone had sucked it away. The investigator read the description. Internal reports indicate that Delta Team was misdirected during their mission, creating a gap for the weapons shipment to reach Red Willow. The initial information reroute was issued by a unit affiliated with Holloway Security Solutions. An older man up front shouted, "That's treason." Another congressman stood up. "If this is true, it's a top-level federal crime." In the corner of the room, Harold Green began to tremble. Jalen placed a hand on his shoulder to steady him. Harold stared at the screen, eyes red, one question spinning in his head. Why would a small town be caught up in something this big? Jalen knew the answer, but didn't want to speak it here. To him, Operation Redline wasn't just a document. It was the grave of 3 teammates he once called brothers. One member of the investigative team held up the file and turned to the committee. This document has never been made public. Its presence in Holloway's office proves he wasn't just connected, he was directly involved. Someone sitting behind Jalen let out a breath and whispered, "He thought Red Willow was his backyard to do whatever he wanted. All day." An older black congressman scanned the room, then spoke slowly, each word landing like a hammer. This country is witnessing that this is not the fault of a single officer. This is an organized system of suppression, and the man at the top is a businessman celebrated for over 10 years. Behind him, reporters scrambled to get every word down. Noise rose like a wave crashing over the room. People shouted, slammed tables, cursed Holloway in terms no one was stopping now. A woman sobbed. "How many of our kids got labeled criminals just for being black?" A man snapped. "We've spent our whole lives being watched like we're already guilty." In the middle of the chaos, Jalen remained still, eyes fixed on the Operation Redline slide. He wasn't searching anymore. He was memorizing the truth, making sure no one could twist this story later. Harold turned to his son and asked quietly, "You okay?" Jalen replied, "This is why I'm still alive." The words brought tears to Harold's eyes. The hearing adjourned in the middle of the uproar, but one thing had become certain. The wall Holloway had built over more than a decade had just been stripped bare in front of the entire country, and no one in Red Willow, not even its police force, could stand behind him now without being dragged down too. As the hearing ended, people hadn't even risen from their seats when the news spread like fire through dry grass. Bradford Holloway had been arrested. Not the kind of arrest where someone is politely invited in for questioning. No, it was handcuffs, right there in the parking lot of the very building he'd used to hide his operation. Dozens of reporters rushed in, microphones raised. But Holloway only bowed his head, face pale, like he had lost all his blood. His once-groomed hair was soaked in sweat. He opened his mouth a few times, but no words came out. As if the explanation he had prepared his whole life had suddenly vanished. 2 federal agents gripped each of his arms, dragging him like a breathing corpse. The soft clink of the cuffs echoed like a closing cage, a sound that rang in Red Willow's ears like the door of a prison they'd been locked in for 40 years without knowing. A woman nearby broke down, crying as she whispered, "Finally!" A man shook his head, voice trembling. "I knew something was wrong, but no one wanted to look." Someone watching Holloway pass by muttered, louder than footsteps, "That's how it ends for a man who sold his soul for power." News of the arrest swept through town in a single afternoon. People who had believed Holloway to be a generous benefactor now looked at each other with blank, embarrassed eyes. They stood outside grocery stores, cafes, the high school football field he had sponsored, staring at signs with his name and not knowing what to say. One man spoke plainly. "He played us like fools." Another replied, "Not just played. He ran the whole damn town." Later that day, the Department of Justice announced a full freeze of Holloway's assets and a lockdown on all companies he controlled. From warehouses to offices, old factories to bank accounts, everything was sealed with red tape. Employees stepped out into the street, stunned. None of them knew whether they were now unemployed or finally free. A technician said, "Now I know why they never let me into the lower floor." A young accountant cried into her phone, "We worked right on top of that mess and didn't even know." Red Willow's police force went strangely silent. Officers who used to strut around South Ridge that day couldn't meet anyone's eyes. They scattered through the station, trying to act normal, but the news of Operation Redline and the surveillance map targeting black neighborhoods meant there was no hiding anymore. The public looked at them without fear. No yelling, no violence. Just the cold stare of people who had finally seen the truth. At the town square, Red Willow gathered in numbers not seen in years. For the first time, black and white residents stood together without sidestepping each other. An older white woman turned to a black man and said, "I didn't know. I really didn't know what they were doing." He replied slowly, "Now you do." In the crowd, everyone carried some weight. Some for staying silent. Some for trusting the wrong man too long. Some for living next to the darkness and refusing to see it. Harold Green stood apart from the crowd, leaning on an iron railing because his legs still hurt. He didn't want to be in the middle of 100 people trying to swallow the truth. He observed from a distance, like he needed space to understand what was unfolding. His eyes were wet, but not from fear or exhaustion. These were the tears of someone who had lived long enough to know that justice, even late, still comes to the door. Harold saw the giant screen showing footage of Holloway in cuffs. He watched for a long time, lips pressed tight. He remembered the years when South Ridge was treated as the place with problems. Remembered the looks police gave black men walking through town. Remembered the rumors of hidden cameras on street poles. Remembered the threats made to poor kids just for riding bikes at the wrong time. All of it now had one answer: the hand of a man. The town once praised as a savior. Jalen Green came to stand beside him, saying nothing. Harold looked at his son, eyes red. "I've lived long enough to see too much bad," Harold said, his voice hoarse. "But I didn't think I'd see this." Jalen placed a hand on his father's shoulder, gently. "You didn't cause this. You just lived in it." Harold looked back at the square. People were still standing there, looking at each other, at the screen, at the empty space they once thought was safe. A woman whispered, 40 years. He controlled this town for 40 years. A man answered, "We gave him that power." No one disagreed. For the first time, Red Willow was looking straight at itself. Holloway, cuffed, was placed into the federal car without applause, without cameras framing him like a hero. He collapsed as soon as he was pushed into the back seat, his head dropping to his chest like someone whose strength had finally vanished. The man who once ran the town couldn't even hold his head up. It wasn't the fall of a criminal. It was the collapse of someone who had stood on top of others for far too long. Harold took a deep breath and closed his eyes. He didn't feel joy. He didn't feel triumph. He only exhaled like someone finally setting down a weight he had carried his entire life. When he opened his eyes, he looked at Jalen and said quietly, but with certainty, "You did what I couldn't bring myself to do back then." In that moment, Red Willow changed, not because Holloway was arrested, but because the town finally dared to look at the years it had let darkness live right next to it. On the day of the trial, the federal courthouse hallway was so crowded that security had to set up 2 layers of barricades. People from South Ridge arrived early in the morning, carrying small signs that read, "Justice for Harold," and "We are not invisible." Even the white residents who had once stayed silent were there now, faces filled with a mix of unease and determination. Inside the courtroom, the scraping of chairs echoed like tension pulled tight. No one said much. It was as if everyone understood this day would close 40 years of being silenced. Harold Green sat in the front row, his hands trembling slightly. When his name was called, he stood and walked slowly to the witness stand. The room went still. He looked around and saw hundreds of faces, all eyes locked on him. He swallowed hard, then spoke with a voice that shook but rang clear, like someone knocking on wood. "Silence killed people. Today I speak." "Ho!" A sigh came from the corner of the room. An older woman covered her mouth. Harold continued, each sentence pulling a heavy memory from his chest. "In 71, I stood a few steps from a young black boy. I saw him get shot. I stood and watched. I was scared. I was poor. I believed no one would listen to me." He glanced at Brandon Hale, who sat with his head bowed, then went on. "I stayed silent for half a lifetime, and that silence made this town believe people like us had no voice. Today, I stand here to say what I should have said back then." Someone in the back row started to cry. Jalen Green, seated nearby, narrowed his eyes to stay composed, but couldn't stop the tightness in his throat. Harold placed a hand on the edge of the stand for balance, then ended with a sentence that made the jury lean forward. "I've lived long enough to know the truth doesn't die when we avoid it. It dies when we're too afraid to name it." As he stepped down, the entire courtroom rose. No clapping, no noise. They stood to honor a thin, quiet man who had just brought back the soul of South Ridge. Next came Brandon Hale. He was led forward, still cuffed, eyes dark from lack of sleep. He looked at the jury like a man with nothing left to hold on to. The prosecutor read the charges: assault, unlawful detention, abuse of power, and participation in a system of racial discrimination. When asked, "Do you plead guilty?" Brandon opened his mouth, and his voice cracked apart. "I do. I plead guilty." A quiet murmur rippled through the room. Brandon kept going. "I did it because I thought I had the right. I thought people from South Ridge were born to be controlled. I thought we were the law." His voice broke. His back curled like he wanted to disappear into himself. "I was wrong. I hit Mr. Harold because I was ordered to. I stopped cars because I was ordered to. I believed in that system. I became its puppet." End of chat. Chief Mills, once his superior, sat at the back of the room, his face heavy as lead. Brandon was led away, head hanging so low his hair covered his face. When the name Bradford Holloway was called, the mood changed entirely. He was escorted in no expensive suit, just a gray prison uniform. He tried to keep his usual composure, but his eyes blinked rapidly, like a man trying to brace but failing. The prosecutor opened a folder. The sound of paper flipping cut through the silence. Bradford Holloway is charged with 3 counts: illegal transportation and trafficking of weapons, unlawful civilian surveillance, and involvement in data manipulation that led to the death of federal soldiers in Operation Redline. A man behind Jalen muttered under his breath, "Who the hell did he think he was, messing with the military?" Holloway stood frozen. The prosecutor showed the surveillance maps on the screen, then the signed memos with Holloway's name, then the Operation Redline report. Each slide landed like a blow. In minutes, the image of a community philanthropist shattered into that of a man running a federal-level oppression machine. Holloway's lawyer tried to stand and object, but even his voice trembled. No one in the room believed arguments like paperwork error or procedural mistake. The evidence was too heavy, too clear, too real. As the prosecutor finished, he said a sentence that made the room go cold. "This is not a greedy businessman. This is a traitor to the nation." At last, the jury stood. 12 faces looked down at their decision, then directly at the courtroom. The judge nodded. The jury foreperson took a deep breath and read the verdict. For the defendant Bradford Holloway, 27 years in federal prison. Land. The room held its breath for a moment, then applause erupted like heavy rain after a long drought. South Ridge residents hugged each other. A few white townspeople stood and clapped too, as if they understood they had just witnessed something this town owed the black community for over 4 decades. Then the foreperson continued. For the defendant Brandon Hale, 18 years in prison for assault, abuse of power, and participation in a system of racial discrimination. Brandon collapsed into his seat. An officer had to steady him just so he could finish hearing the sentence. The clapping continued, not as loud as it had been for Holloway, but steady and clear, like wind sweeping across a long dry field, lifting dust that had been pressed down too long. Harold Green stood watching it all, his hands still shaking, but his eyes shining bright. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His tears fell slow and heavy, but they were the tears of a man who had finally seen justice, not as a dream or a promise, but as something real. Jalen placed a hand on his father's shoulder and gave it a gentle squeeze, as if to say, "You see, Dad, you're not silent anymore." The trial closed, like a long chapter of Red Willow being torn open, rewritten with truth, with voices once treated as invisible, and with the justice they had deserved for far too long. 3 weeks after the trial, Red Willow settled the way small towns often do after a storm, quiet on the surface, shaken underneath. The grocery store reopened. The gas station played country music on the radio. Kids rode bikes around the schoolyard. But Southridge still wore a strange silence, like people who had lived under too many storms couldn't quite believe the sky was really clear. Harold Green slowed down inside his small house, his hands still trembling a little when pouring morning coffee. The bruises had faded, but the sound of batons and the cold smell of cement from that day still lingered in his mind like a shadow standing behind his shoulder. That night, while Harold was fixing an old radio on the kitchen table, frequency 67.9 suddenly lit up faintly. The small light beside the number blinked once, then crackled softly. Harold froze. He thought he'd imagined it. But the sound was real familiar. Frequency 67.9 was one he'd kept for half a century. The frequency of the disappeared. The frequency of memories he never dared let go. It had been silent for 3 weeks, ever since the night Jalen saved him in the West Side warehouse. Harold sat upright, leaned toward the machine. A burst of static lasted a few seconds. Then a raspy voice broke through, heavy like someone crawling up from deep underground just to speak. "Green, I'm still alive." Harold grabbed the radio with both hands, his heart pounding hard in his old chest. The voice wasn't Brandon's. It wasn't Holloway's. It wasn't anyone from Red Willow. It belonged to a grown man, deep, hoarse, every word nearly breaking. But there was something in it that chilled Harold to the bone, the chill of unfinished things he thought had been buried with Holloway. He whispered, "Who is this?" The radio didn't answer right away. Only static came through, like wind brushing through wire. Then the voice returned, slow, heavy. "Green, you know me." Jalen Green was cleaning his gun at the living room table when he heard his father call out, "Jalen!" He stood immediately and walked into the kitchen. Harold had set the radio in the middle of the table, eyes wide. Jalen touched the device, listening as the trembling frequency hummed again. The static cut through the speaker, and the voice returned, clearer this time. "Green, I'm still alive." Jalen looked at his father. Harold shook his head. "I don't know who, but that voice isn't playing." Jalen leaned in close to the speaker, his eyes narrowing like a man with combat experience, recognizing a signal that wasn't civilian. He listened to the breaths between words fractured, labored. The breath of someone wounded, someone being hunted, or someone who had survived something no one was meant to survive. Jalen said slowly, "That voice isn't from Red Willow." Harold nodded, his hands trembling more than before. "I know. But he called them green, like he knows us." Outside, an engine rumbled slow and steady. Jalen turned toward the window. Headlights swept across the living room wall and stopped right outside their house. A black SUV with no plates had pulled up tight to the curb, engine still running. It looked exactly like the ones that had parked there the night Holloway gave the order to hunt Jalen. Harold jumped up, clutching his chest. Jalen moved to the window and lifted the curtain just slightly. The SUV didn't move. Its interior lights were off, but Jalen saw the silhouette of someone in the driver's seat. No movement, no signal, no departure. It just sat there like the period at the end of a threat. Jalen said softly, "Dad, get inside." Harold didn't argue. He stepped back, eyes still locked on the vehicle. Jalen looked over at the radio. The indicator light, which had been pale green, had turned red. A soft click came through, and the raspy voice changed sharper now. Metallic. Urgent. Project Rise. Phase 2. Harold stared at the radio, and a cold chill ran down his spine like ice water poured across his back. Jalen didn't blink. His eyes were fixed on the red blinking light on the device, each flash like a warning of something bigger than Holloway, bigger than the Red Willow police, bigger than anything in a small-town story. The voice spoke one last time, nearly a whisper dragged across the blade of a knife. "Don't turn off the radio tonight." The radio went silent after that, but the red light stayed on. The SUV outside didn't move, like it was waiting for orders from somewhere else. Jalen stepped into the middle of the kitchen, eyes sharpening, his voice low enough not to panic his father, but clear enough that even he could hear it like a new vow. "Dad, this isn't over." Harold swallowed hard and asked softly, Do you know what's about to happen? Jalen looked at the radio, at the SUV, at the darkness beyond the yard, then said, "If they're calling this Phase 2, then Phase 1 was just the surface. We've hit the real system. Holloway was only the front." And Harold sat down, hand to his forehead, trying to steady his breath. Jalen picked up the radio, turned the frequency dial, but 67.9 was now locked. No up, no down. The red light on the device glowed like someone's eyes staring straight through them. Jalen set it down, his hand clenched tight. Outside, the SUV turned its headlights on again, beaming directly at their front door. Harold asked, "What are you planning to do?" Jalen answered without turning his head, "I'm getting ready." A soft click echoed again, but this time it wasn't from the radio. It came from Jalen's phone. A message had arrived, no number, no name, just a single line. "Phase 2 will start tonight." Jalen drew a deep breath, then turned off the screen. "Dad," he said, "we're stepping into a war zone." Harold looked at his son, his eyes wet. "Jalen, are you sure you want to keep going?" Jalen glanced at the radio one more time, recalling the last words that echoed in his memory. "Don't turn off the radio tonight," he answered, voice low but tight as drawn steel. "I won't turn it off." And that night, while Red Willow slept, the greenhouse stayed lit, the red light of the radio blinking like the heartbeat of a monster waking up. Project Rise Phase 2 had begun, and it was waiting for them to step in.